Okay, welcome to the 26th Virtual History of 2021, presented by the Baltimore Architecture Foundation and Baltimore Heritage. My name is Nathan Denny's, Associate Director of the Baltimore Architecture Foundation. First, thank you to everyone who donated to be with us today. Your support has allowed us to continue hosting these virtual histories every week. And I hope that you can join us next week for a special panel discussion featuring diverse designers telling their stories. One of them is Helen Staley, who in 1955 became the first woman to join the American Institute of Architects Baltimore chapter. The panel is part of the Say It Loud Maryland exhibition hosted by the Baltimore Architecture Foundation, AIA Baltimore, and Be More Noma. The exhibition is launching in person at the Baltimore Center for Architecture and Design on October 1st. And now for today's presentation. Those of you who participated in our Architecture Madness tournament this spring might remember that the Church of the Redeemer made it to the semifinals. The Baltimore Architecture Foundation had the chance to tour it in February of last year, and it is absolutely stunning. To take us on a virtual tour is Stephen Studer. Stephen is a senior interior designer associate at the Chambers Architecture and Interior Design firm. He is a member of the Church of the Redeemer, where he serves as its junior warden, which traditionally in the Episcopal Church means being in charge of the building and grounds. So I think we're in very good hands. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please add them to the Q&A box. For that, Stephen, take it away.
Okay, thank you, everybody. The parish was formed in 1854, chartered in 1855. They first met in what was called the Govinstown Academy, a small stone schoolhouse at what is now Bologna and Lake Avenue. In 1856, David Perrine offered this fledgling parish 3 sites on his 391-acre estate, which he called Homeland, stretching from Melrose Avenue to Homeland Avenue, from Charles Street to the York Road. The site committee for the new church selected a 1.5-acre lot on the highest spot on the Perrine farm, fronting up what was then a dirt road called Charles Street Extended. The first church, which we're looking at now, was designed by Richard, Nathan, Richard Snowden Andrews. He apprenticed at Nearnsey and Nielsen, which the architects in our audience today will know. And he later designed the old Treasury building in Washington, D.C., other federal buildings. He designed the manse at the First and Franklin Presbyterian Church, Calvert Hall School on Saratoga Street, and the former Eastern Female High School at Orleans and North Asquith Streets. The church was small, 50 families as members. It was designed in the English parish style. Mr. Perrine gave the stone to build the church from his quarry, which is located at what is now Northern Parkway and Charles Street, the southwest corner. If you're ever at that corner at a traffic light, you can look over and see it's a very deep swale. That was the quarry for their farm. The building was most likely completed in December of 1857, and in March of 1858, letters of consecration were received by the parish, and the first services were held in the autumn of 1858. In 1864, a rectory was built next to the church, and again with stone from the Perrine quarry. In 1870, a major renovation of the church was undertaken. A new chancel was pushed out from the back, and a new spire was designed by architect David Crummer of Baltimore. New slate roof was put on, and additional pews were added. In 1882, David Perrine died and left the church additional ground from its current site up to Melrose Avenue and back to a lane that ran parallel to Charles Street. That's the acreage that we presently have, which is about 9 acres. The parish was growing. In 1912, a second major renovation took place, upgrading the interior finishes and the north and south transepts. In 1922, David Perrine's son, Elias Perrine, died, and the remaining 317 acres of the estate was purchased by the Roland Park Company, which then developed it as the neighborhood of Homeland. The congregation was growing, and an extension of the north transept was added in 1923. The parish hall was built in 28 and enlarged in 1949. In 1953, the first 50 families had grown to 1,004 families attending. It was the fastest growing parish in the Maryland Diocese. So we can go to the next slide, Nathan. So here you can see the current complex. The chapel itself, only the side walls remain from the original building from 1858. The chapel now reflects the renovations of 1870, the new spire, and 1912, the cruciform shape with the addition of the transepts and the new chancel at the rear. They knew they needed a new building. So among architects that were considered, recommended by the DC architectural critic Frederick Guttheim, were Belluschi, Saarinen, Edward Durrell Stone, Brewer, and Gropius. Belluschi was chosen to move forward with proposals for the addition. According to the young rector, Bennett Sims, Belluschi strove to struggle for a creative solution to the problem without preconceived plans and ideas. He seemed the tallest man in understanding, artistic sensibility, and humility of spirit. So we can look at the next slide, please. Bennett Sims was also impressed that Belluschi understood the need to maintain the chapel as the point of reference on the campus. To begin, Belluschi presented slides of his existing work to the parish, many of whom were shocked at the notion of a modernist building. For some time, that presentation was referred to in the parish as Black Tuesday. Opposition to a modernist building grew, and some members of the congregation advocated for hiring a traditionalist architect. Belluschi returned once again to address the congregation to speak of his ideals concerning contemporary architecture. After that visit, the congregation voted as to whether to continue with Belluschi or hire a more traditionalist architect. Belluschi won the vote by a very narrow margin. He chose as his project architects two young fellows by the name of Archibald Rogers and Francis Talaferro, specifying it would be a true collaboration. Talaferro had greatly admired Belluschi and at one time considered leaving the architectural practice and returning to MIT to study further with him. Belluschi, with Rogers and Talaferro, and then Charles Lamb, who had just joined their small firm, presented initial sketches to the congregation and encountered a second stumbling block. The church had established a $300,000 budget. When the new building plan was estimated, it came to $975,000. Eventually this, like the modernism itself, was overcome and they moved forward. There's one area where all of the buildings from 1858 come together. Can we see the next slide? So this courtyard shows the original wall of the 1858 chapel. The next slide is the 1923 parish hall. The next slide is the landscaping, which was an important part of this entire program. Belluschi integrated 5 courtyards into his plan, intimate, contemplative spaces that grew out of his interest in Zen Buddhism. These photos are of the largest courtyard that connects all the building phases, beautifully enclosed in a distinctive wooden fence, a spot that unites the disparate architectural styles. A second columbarium was added here, as you can see on the wall of the church. The first one was on the south side of the chapel. The rector, Bennett Sims, was the true force behind Belluschi. Sims remarked, once the buildings were complete, that this building was a profound turning point in his ministerial career, redirecting, in his own words, my whole understanding of history and the human aspiration after truth and beauty. The next slide. Here we see some elements that Belluschi would eventually bring into the new church. The stone structure, the pointed arch, and the stickwork at the gables. The next slide. Over approximately 2 years, the plans were developed, including the site plan. The new buildings were to include the church itself, an administrative building, and a day school. On the site plan, Rogers and Taliaferro and Lamb argued against Belluschi's initial notion of placing the new buildings behind and to the south of the existing church. They felt it would be too tight. Here you can see the lane at the rear of the property and the one on the south side, to the right in this photograph. Rogers, Taliaferro, and Lamb suggested placing the new complex behind and to the north of the older church. This offered the option of a distinct entry to the church that would not compete with the entry to what would become the chapel. The new entry is in the upper left-hand corner of the photograph. This plan, however, would mean the destruction of the rectory, but the stone from that would be used in the new buildings. It also allowed the entire complex to be sited so that there was significant green space surrounding it and a beautiful frame for the buildings. May we have the next slide? This is the entry courtyard to the complex that is about as far away from the entrance to the chapel as one can get. The next slide. The church building was to echo the shape of the existing church, a cruciform plan. What was taken from the chapel were the Gothic arch, the pitch, height, and material of the roof, the cruciform shape, and the stickwork at the gables, and of course the use of stone. Despite the architectural relationship to elements of the existing church, there's a subtle Japanese reference that pervades these new buildings. In 1954 and 55, the Museum of Modern Art held a substantive exhibition of Japanese architecture. And in 1956, Belluschi made his first trip to the Far East to Japan. This trip and the MoMA exhibit, which he is known to have attended, likely influenced Belluschi with the Iramoya roofline and, as noted, intimate landscaped courtyards as places for contemplation, conversation, and transition between structure and nature. In this slide, you actually see the third columbarium at Redeemer, which was completed in 2018 in the arch shape, echoing the structure of the new church. So let's go inside. May we have the next slide? Here we're standing at the entrance to the nave, looking toward the west window. The next slide. Here we're looking into the south transept. Note the reference to the stickwork in the upper amber glass taken from the chapel gables, and in both photographs, the reference to the Gothic arch. Can we go back one slide, Nathan? There we go. In May of 1956, Belluschi argued against the congregational idea of holding a design competition for the west-facing window. He brought in Yuri Kepes, professor of visual design, a colleague at MIT and a close friend. He wanted the window to be fully integrated into the design of the chancel. Kepes created a design which was executed by the workshop of Gabriel Loire in Chartres, France, and is considered one of the first uses of this modern colored glass technique in the United States. The design has a subtle evocation of a cross in lighter colors, which the rector, Mr. Sims, hoped would be more defined. However, Kepes explained that this was not a sign, but a symbol. He noted, "A sign is easy to read and forget. Part of the very nature of a true symbol is its subtlety. It cannot be encompassed in a glance. It calls for more than eyesight for appropriation. It demands a measure of insight. Its seeming weakness is precisely its great strength. Man can never capture the whole meaning of what he symbolizes in outward form. True symbols are therefore never exhaustive, but suggestive, leaving room for the deep levels of mystery inherent in all truth." So can we go, there we go. One substantive difference in the interior of the new church, reflecting bold new liturgical form, is that the chancel is actually brought forward into the congregation rather than in a recess. The rector, Bennett Sims, described this as communal rather than hierarchical. Can we go to the next slide? Here, as we close in on the west window, you can begin to see the very subtle symbol of the cross in the lighter glass. The next slide. And the next slide. What eludes many people is that the chancel window is actually an inside window. Behind it is another gable that matches the other three, and under that is the church sacristy. The colored glass window is both naturally and artificially lighted. So we can go to the next slide. Here we see that the colored glass is encased in concrete and epoxy. The next slide. Here are how the panels are mounted to the arches. And the next slide. Some of the artificial lighting that plays upon the glass. And the next slide. The band of glass from Germany in varying shades of purple, blue, and gold makes clear that the roof is not resting on the low stone walls, but especially from outside at night, the roof seems to float above this ribbon of glass. The next slide. The band of jewel-toned glass surrounds the entire nave and ties the space together. And now the next slide. Belluschi, in his desire for the handcrafted, designed the stone walls to be rough and had the mortar applied thickly with trowels and with the use of the mason's hands, an indication of the hand of man rather than that of the machine. The stone came from the Old Rectory. The next slide. Another example of a symbol rather than a sign is the cross suspended over the altar. The metal cross was designed by Ronald Hayes Pearson, a preeminent metalsmith who is represented in, among other museums and important buildings, the Smithsonian. It was, as the lighter glass cross in the west window, designed to come into one's conscience slowly as one became accustomed to the light. The next slide. Here we see the skeletal cross against the wood. And we can go to the next slide. Belluschi was extremely busy as the church began to take final shape, not only as Dean of Architecture at MIT, but with his numerous outside commitments. Rogers, Taliaferro, and Lamb were tasked with substantive design decisions. An important one, much as their early suggestion to move the new buildings to the north of the chapel, was to remove a thin steeple that Belluschi thought to place on the new building above the crossing of the church. Belluschi agreed with that decision as well. As the project moved into the finishing stages, Belluschi became more intimately involved. He developed the design of the chancel furniture, the next slide, the processional cross and candlesticks, He approved the color of the marble for the altar, the next slide, and designed the altar candlesticks, the ciborium, the baptismal font, and the pews. Originally, the floor was in a lavender carpet, but that was later removed and replaced with a slate that you have seen throughout. The carpet dampened both music and the spoken word. The next slide. The Austin organ in the north transept has approximately 4,250 pipes and 58 digital voices. It combines ancient musical form with modern technology, with multiple levels of memory, enabling the organist to set and recall combination of stops at the press of a button. In addition, there is a recording system which captures the performance of a piece and can play it back exactly as performed. The next slide. A 2011 organ renovation included the addition of the horizontal trumpets, as well as other pipes in the rear gallery. So now we'll move on to outside again. Here we are looking down at the new columbarium. This is another courtyard space, beautifully planted with benches for contemplation of the niches. The next slide. Here we are looking down on 2 of the 5 courtyards. The 3 of those courtyards are named after churches that Redeemer helped to start. The one on the left has a small labyrinth and a bubbling fountain. Again, these were designed for individual respite, small conversational meetings, and simply to be outdoors. The next slide. Here we're looking down at that courtyard that we saw earlier. On the left is the chapel, on the right is the new church, and then we also encompass the 1923 and 1928 editions. The next slide. The Finnish Church, the result of the architects, the workmen, the landscape architects, was pleasing to Belluschi. He felt it was what he had envisioned. In the words of Meredith Clausen, his colleague and author of a monograph on his work and a book on his spiritual buildings, Belluschi felt Redeemer encompassed rational structure, appropriate scale, harmonious proportions, exquisite materials, fine craftsmanship, subdued lighting, and an eloquent, moving space. The church was consecrated in 1958, 100 years after the consecration of the original church. In 1986, aware of the irony of the initial opposition to his designs and the then great affection of the congregation for the buildings, and after numerous design and engineering awards, including an AIA Honors Award and a 25-year award from the Baltimore chapter, Belluschi wrote a letter to the congregation expressing his thoughts on the true nature of church. He said, "People in time will come to understand that a church is much more than a building to be created from remembered images of the past. It is people coming together in common desire to evoke the commanding vision of God's eternal harmony, which entails a continuous search for what is in harmony with our time." And as we might say here in the church, here endeth the lesson. So, I would like to thank Christina Paglinawan, a member of our clergy team, for her tech assistance, Mark Schroeder, our Director of Facilities, for help in putting the PowerPoint together, and Harrison Hart of the Harrison Hart Photography for the beautiful photographs. And of course, the Baltimore chapter of the American Institute of Architects and the Baltimore Architecture Foundation for allowing us to introduce our beloved Redeemer, to those in attendance.
Thank you, Stephen. And if you have any questions for Stephen, please add them to the chat box or the Q&A box. So is it safe to say that the congregation now loves the design of the modern church?
I would say it's probably more than loves it. Yeah.
Great. And what do you think makes the church so beloved in its design? Like why does it resonate so much with people?
Well, for me, it combines humanity and divinity. The stone, the wood, and so forth is the human element, but it also has a divine quality in the soaring space, the beautiful lighting, and the window, the west-facing window. And what does that harken back to but the person that we call our Redeemer, Jesus, who was both human and divine. And to me, as Meredith Clausen said in the book on his spiritual buildings, it is one of the most satisfying of all of his churches and synagogues. So.
Thanks. Okay, I see some more questions coming in. First one I have here is, how has the blue floor slate held up, and is it sealed?
I don't know if it's sealed. It's certainly held up beautifully. So yeah, the lavender carpet was beautiful in terms of color. This was before my time, but here at Redeemer, but it was beautiful in relationship to the stone and the wood. But I do know an Episcopal priest who said, yeah, we refer to Redeemer as the Lavender Hill Gang. So, but yeah, but that really did dampen the sound. Yeah, but the stone is held up beautifully.
And here's another question for you. Was the rectory rebuilt at the same time, and who was the architect for it?
We do have, and I think this question is referring to not the old rectory from the original, from 18, whatever it was, 86, 46, which was torn down to provide the stone for the church. There was a rectory built across Melrose Avenue at the corner of Charles Street, which is no longer used. I don't know if that was Belluschi or whether that was RTKL, which the architecture firm became that worked with him. It is no longer used. It's a private home now. Churches now do not provide a place to live because what, in essence, they understood was that when a rector retired, they did not have a house to sell to, to fund retirement and so forth. So yeah, so it works differently in churches these days.
And here's a good question, which is it possible to visit the church now?
No, only if you pledge. No, I'm kidding. Yes, you certainly can. Yes, we would love it. Yeah, if enough people wanted to do it, I'm just always thrilled to show people around here. So I would be happy to do it as an in-person. Obviously we were closed during last year. We held our services outside with limited numbers of people. I sat wrapped in a coat and a scarf at times and so forth. So, but we are open now for services and wearing masks, but we have to see, I guess, where COVID goes. So
yeah. And are you open during the week? Like, what are the hours of the church?
Mm-hmm. Christina, what?
Well, there's staff on site.
Yeah.
And the doors aren't always unlocked, but if they,
Mm-hmm.
were to call kind of ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, if you called ahead, and I unfortunately, I'm still working. I didn't mean that. If anybody from Chambers is listening, fortunately I'm still working. But so I couldn't just show up one day and take a couple of people through. But yeah, Yeah, I would say call the church and just say, we'd love to come in and see the space. It's pretty, you know, the photographs are beautiful, but they don't capture the real feeling of standing in here. So.
I've got some good comments coming into. Judy here is saying that she's been to the church a few times and never really thought of it as modern. And that's a tribute to Belluschi's work, that it has this timeless quality to it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so.
And a few people sharing memories of the opening in the late 50s with Bennett Sims. Here, Jane is saying that she remembers Bennett Sims well, and that her father was church treasurer doing the design of the building staging. It was very controversial at the time.
Yes. There's I don't know whether this is an apocryphal story or not, but the vestry in the Episcopal Church is the governing board and also holds the purse strings. And there's a story that says that a prominent member of the vestry were leaning toward the traditionalist architect. And then a prominent member of the vestry came to a vestry meeting and said, I spent time with my children who are young adults, and I'm going for Belluschi. My children said, are you building this for yourself, or are you building this for us and our children?
A few people have asked if there are any images of the Old Rectory.
Yes, I do have one. Yeah, so apparently, according to a book that was published on the 100th anniversary of the church, it was not very well made or well constructed. They had continuing problems with leaks and so forth, and so it was always under reconstruction. But they felt it was important because the first rectors lived far away. I mean, you know, we were way out in the country. So, you know, just from Homeland Avenue to Melrose Avenue, the extent of the Perrine estate is a mile. So, yeah, so it was way out in the country. This was at a time when North Avenue was the northern boundary of the city.
Mm-hmm. And Jane McMillan is wondering if the open work cross was done in that way to represent the crown of thorns.
I don't know, but it's beautiful. I mean, it's a beautiful thought, if in fact it was. You know, I have to say part of Belluschi's thinking was about symbols rather than signs, about, you know, walking into the church and then having it sort of unfold slowly. So I don't know that. I'll try to find out.
But yeah, but like you're saying, it's about your personal connection to it rather than like this is supposed to symbolize exactly this thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, as he said, I gave a very abbreviated example of Kepish's quote, but yeah, a sign is a stop sign. Tells me to stop, and then I go on. A sign is a yield sign. A sign is an exit sign. So he wanted symbols. So yeah.
Okay, and this is the last question before we wrap up. You mentioned that you can call the church if you wanted to schedule a visit. And is there a particular number people should call?
410
410
435
435
7333.
7333.
I think I got that right.
435 7333. That's it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Stephen. This was a great presentation, and I hope that we could do it maybe an in-person tour at some point too. That was great fun when we did that back in February. That was the last tour that we did before the pandemic stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, it is a beautiful campus, and you're totally right. The images are beautiful, but they don't really do it justice when you're actually standing in that beautiful space.
Yes. Yeah. So, well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.